You'll get nothing, Natalie, just like you deserve. That's what my father said, right in the middle of the will reading. Right in front of everyone, cousins, uncles, family friends, the lawyer, even the damn housekeeper who had served this family longer than I'd been alive. His voice was calm, controlled, like he was giving a speech he'd practiced in the mirror. The room went silent. You could hear the fireplace crackle behind me and the faint clink of someone dropping their glass onto the tray too hard. But me? I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I smiled because I already knew what he didn't. Let me back up. My name is Natalie Pierce. I'm 29 years old, the only daughter of Richard Pierce, CEO of Pierce Holdings, a man who believes legacy is written by men, passed to sons, and occasionally to sons-in-law. But never daughters, never me. Growing up, I was invisible in his shadow. I got straight A's, started a non-profit in college, even helped restructure one of his failing divisions when I was just 23. None of it mattered. He told people I was the emotional one, said I was too sensitive for business, too soft-hearted, he'd whisper behind my back, as if compassion were a flaw. Meanwhile, my brother Carter flunked out of 2 Ivy League schools and still got a company car. But the real twist? The man who did see me, the one who believed in me, was my grandfather, Henry Pierce, my father's father, the founder, the empire builder, the only person in this bloodline who treated me like I mattered. He used to say, "Natalie, the problem with your dad isn't that he underestimates you. It's that he's terrified of you becoming everything he couldn't control." I thought he was just being kind. I didn't know then how right he was. When Grandpa got sick, it was me who visited him every morning. I brought his meds, read him the paper, laughed at his terrible jokes. I took phone calls from his lawyers, made sure the house staff wasn't skimming his pills. And when the end started to show, when his hands shook and he forgot my name, I still sat beside him. But at the funeral, my father didn't even mention me in his eulogy. He stood there in his black-tailored suit, delivering a polished tribute filled with half-truths and fake tears, all while his eyes scanned the room like a predator circling his next board vote. And I knew he was going to erase me from everything. So when the lawyer called for the official will reading 2 weeks later, I wasn't surprised to be seated at the far end of the table, next to the radiator no less, while Carter sat beside Dad, front and centre, sipping his bourbon like he was already CEO. The lawyer, Mr. Ellsworth, cleared his throat and opened the folder. But before he could speak, my father stood, lifted his glass, and dropped the hammer. "To the future of this family," he said, smiling like a villain out of an old Bond movie. "To my son, who will carry the Pierce name into its next chapter, and to my daughter, who chose her emotions over loyalty." People chuckled nervously. A few glanced at me with pity. My Aunt Barbara looked like she wanted to sink under the table. I stared at my father and said nothing, because I didn't need to. You see, months before Grandpa passed, he made a change to his will. A very quiet change. He didn't trust Richard anymore. Too much greed, too much control. So he asked me to meet with his private counsel, outside of the family lawyers. I helped him draft something different, something binding, something that named me the primary heir to the Pierce legacy. Every asset, every property, every vote. But I said nothing, because I wanted to see their faces when it hit. I sat through my father's smug monologue. I endured Carter's little smirk, the one he gets when he thinks he's finally won. I sipped my water. I tapped my fingers against the mahogany. I waited. And when Mr. Ellsworth finally opened the right envelope, the one with the notarized seal, the one Richard didn't know existed, He paused, cleared his throat again, and said the words that lit the fuse. As per Mr. Henry Pierce's final signed directive, the majority estate, including controlling interest in Pierce Holdings, is hereby transferred to his granddaughter, Natalie Pierce. The silence was absolute. You could hear hearts breaking. You could hear egos shattering. Carter choked on his drink. My father's hand froze mid-air, his glass tipped slightly, red wine spilling across the documents like blood. I looked up, met his eyes, and smiled. Because this was just the beginning. You don't just take down a man like Richard Pierce by accident. It takes precision, patience, the kind of patience that tastes like blood when you bite your tongue through yet another insult dressed as advice. The kind of precision that keeps you smiling at Sunday brunch while your father talks over you, again, and your brother explains basic economics to you like you didn't earn 2 Ivy League degrees. I didn't wake up one day and decide to go to war with my father. I didn't even want his empire, not at first. I wanted peace, recognition, maybe a little respect. But what I got was a lifetime of erasure. I was the child who was told to sit still, smile pretty, and let the men handle the future. The final straw wasn't even that will reading. No, it came years before. It was the day I brought him the business plan I'd been developing in secret, an environmentally focused logistics startup built to modernize one of our oldest, most wasteful divisions. I poured 6 months into that proposal, and when I laid it on his desk, glowing with pride, he didn't even read it. He pushed it aside like a napkin and said, "Natalie, you're a lovely girl. You should focus on things that make you wife material." I sat there stunned, the kind of stunned that burns, and I said, "Thank you." Then I walked out of his office, straight to my apartment, locked the door, and got to work. That was the day the shift happened. I stopped seeking his approval and started planning for independence. He thought he was raising a daughter he could control. What he raised was a strategist. I started small. I joined boards he didn't notice, consulted for friends in tech, invested in startups under a pseudonym. I created an LLC, Iron Ivy, named after my grandmother, the only woman I ever saw Richard fear. I used that LLC to build my own web of assets, quietly, methodically, and I waited. Every family dinner, every board meeting, every time I was asked to fetch coffee while Carter gave half-baked pitches, I waited. I kept my tone sweet, my smile sharp, my ambition tucked neatly behind a silk blouse and neutral lipstick. I played the obedient daughter on the surface while I became something else entirely underneath. When Grandpa's health started declining, I leaned in. Not for the inheritance. I didn't even know yet he was planning to change the will. I just wanted to be there. The real kind of there. The kind that holds a hand through confusion and dementia and fear. But even then, I started noticing things. How Richard cut corners on Grandpa's care. How he dismissed his concerns, pushed for power of attorney papers that would funnel everything into his name. So I stepped in. I asked Grandpa if he trusted the family lawyers. He said no. I asked if he wanted a second opinion. He nodded. From there, it all moved faster than I expected. Grandpa insisted on seeing the revised paperwork. "I may be dying," he told me one day while I was feeding him soup, "but I'm not blind. I see what you've done. I see who you are." I didn't cry. I nodded. And I told him I'd make sure he was protected. So I met with his private counsel. I arranged for his final wishes to be sealed, notarized, and distributed only under specific conditions. I didn't need him to favor me. I just needed him to tell the truth. Richard was so distracted by his own greed, he didn't even notice. He spent those final weeks positioning Carter, rehearsing how they'd celebrate the family's next chapter. Meanwhile, I was building my own. And yes, there were moments I wanted to scream, to throw everything on the table and yell, "Look at me! I'm not the help. I'm your daughter." But I didn't, because I knew the moment would come. I stored every email, every voicemail that hinted at Richard's manipulation. I compiled records of misappropriated funds he'd shifted between accounts. I made copies of everything and locked them in a vault under my name. Not for revenge, for leverage, for protection. He thought his legacy was secure because Carter shared his last name. But I knew the real game. Names don't build empires. Vision does. Loyalty does. And while Carter was out partying in Cabo on company credit cards, I was sitting in investor meetings making actual moves. And through it all, I stayed silent. Until the will reading. That's what made it so satisfying. They thought I'd be shocked, that I'd burst into tears or storm out. They had no idea that while they were plotting my exclusion, I had already claimed the throne. So when Richard stood there that day, glass raised, voice dripping with condescension, and told the room I'd get nothing, all I could think was, "You poor, stupid man. You don't even realize I've already taken everything. And I haven't even started yet." The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was how sure he was that I wouldn't fight back. My father strutted into that will reading like a king returning from war, arms wide, voice booming, ego barely fitting through the mahogany doorway of the conference room. He wore his favorite navy blazer, the one with the gold buttons he said made him look presidential. He shook hands like a politician, slapped Carter on the back like he was passing down a crown, and then he looked at me. That smug, amused little smirk I'd known since childhood crept across his face. "You're early," he said, glancing at his Rolex. "Trying to make up for lost time, sweetheart." He said it loud enough for the room to hear. I smiled, as if it didn't sting, as if the years of being talked over, dismissed, belittled, all in front of family, colleagues, strangers, hadn't taught me how to turn numbness into armor. But the thing about Richard Pierce was he didn't just underestimate me. He delighted in doing it publicly. It was performance art for him, a way to maintain dominance, to remind everyone who sat where in his little kingdom. He made a show of pulling out the chair at the head of the table, for Carter, of course, and then took the seat beside him. I sat across from them, quiet, composed, while they talked shop like I didn't exist. "Carter's already lining up the China deal," Richard said to the attorney, loud enough to echo. "He'll be heading Pierce Enterprises within the quarter." The lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Wallace, said nothing, just adjusted his glasses and glanced at the folder in front of him. He looked like he wanted to speak, but held back. Carter leaned back in his chair, legs spread, arms folded like a frat boy who had just won a bet. "It's time for fresh blood, right? No offense, Dad, but you were getting a little analog." Richard roared with laughter. "That's my boy!" I watched them, my stomach a knot of anger and cold calculation. This was the man who told me I was too emotional to handle corporate pressure. The same man who once asked if I'd run off and get pregnant instead of closing a merger deal. The man who made sure Carter had mentors, training, resources, and handed me nothing but empty praise and a pat on the head. "You're a pretty face, Natalie," he once told me when I asked for a leadership role. "Don't ruin it by acting like you've got something to prove." And here he was again, building Carter up with the same arrogance that had built his entire empire. He didn't just think Carter deserved it. He thought I didn't. The will reading began with the usual: assets, properties, numbers that barely registered as I stared at my father's face, so confident, so certain that he'd won, that this room, this moment, belonged to him. Even as Wallace's tone changed, his voice growing deliberate, the language shifting from generic to specific, Richard barely blinked. He wasn't listening, not really, until Wallace cleared his throat and said, "The remainder of the estate, including full controlling shares of Pierce Enterprises, will go to Natalie Carter, effective immediately." Silence. The kind that hits like a gunshot. Richard blinked. Once, then again, like the words hadn't quite translated. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Wallace didn't flinch. "Your father changed his will 3 weeks before his passing. He named Natalie as sole beneficiary of the controlling interest. Carter retains a trust fund, but the business and the estate belong to her." Carter sat up straighter, his jaw hanging open like a broken hinge. That can't be right." I looked directly at Richard, watching his face go from pale to red in less than 10 seconds. "You must be joking," he said finally. "My father would never—" "He did," I said calmly, my voice like glass, "because he saw what you refused to." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "You conned him! You manipulated an old man when he wasn't thinking straight." Wallace interjected before I could. "We had multiple assessments of Mr. Pierce's mental state during that time. He was fully lucid. The changes were legally binding and witnessed by a third-party firm." Richard stood, pacing like a lion who suddenly realized the cage door was locked from the outside. "You don't know what you're doing, Natalie," he hissed. "You're not ready for this." "I've been ready," I said. "I just stopped waiting for your permission." Carter still hadn't spoken. He just sat there, stunned, mouth half open, like a child who dropped his ice cream cone and couldn't figure out who to blame. Richard leaned in across the table. His voice dropped into that condescending growl I'd heard all my life. "You're going to ruin everything! You think this is some feminist victory story? This is a corporation, not a charity." I didn't blink. "And I'm not your little girl anymore." He recoiled like I'd slapped him. That was the moment it shifted. Not just in the room, but in him. For the first time in his life, he saw me not as his daughter, but as a threat. And let me tell you, there's nothing more dangerous than a man who's just realized the empire he built was stolen from under him by the woman he dismissed. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Because Richard Pierce finally understood. The daughter he mocked, ignored, underestimated, was now the one holding his legacy in her hands. And she wasn't afraid to let it burn. The thing about power is, once you taste it, you stop asking for permission to exist. After that will reading, I didn't celebrate. I didn't pop champagne or take a victory lap. I walked out of that law office and sat in my car, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Because I knew what was coming next. Richard wouldn't just roll over. He'd come for me, slowly, methodically, the way he always did. Manipulative calls, backdoor meetings with board members, whisper campaigns, legal threats disguised as concern. That man didn't know how to lose gracefully. He only knew how to destroy. So I beat him at his own game. The next morning, before the sun came up, I was at the Pierce Enterprises building. My building now. I stepped into the executive elevator with the kind of calm that comes from knowing your enemy still thinks you're weak. I went straight to my grandfather's old office, my office, and changed the locks. Then I met with every department head, one-on-one, quietly, intentionally. I listened more than I spoke. I asked questions Richard never bothered asking, about morale, long-term strategy, even break room culture. And when I walked out of each meeting, I left a paper trail. Because if Richard tried to claim I was incompetent, I'd have receipts proving otherwise. But that wasn't enough. Richard's reach was long. Too many people inside still owed him favours or feared him. I needed to cut his influence off at the knees, so I called an emergency board meeting. He showed up late, of course, smiling, confident, wearing that navy blazer like a battle flag. He walked in with Carter flanking him, and for a second I saw it, the way they still believed this was theirs, like I was just keeping the seat warm. "Gentlemen," he greeted the room, not even glancing at me. "Let's talk damage control." I cleared my throat. "This isn't a damage control meeting," I said. "This is a restructuring session." That got their attention. I passed out printed packets. Inside, detailed reports of embezzlement under Richard's tenure, shady overseas investments, and Carter's misuse of corporate funds for personal expenses, first-class flights, luxury resorts, even a company-funded yacht party in Ibiza. Silence fell. A thick, stunned silence. Richard looked at the papers, then back at me. "This is absurd." "It's documented," I said, "and independently verified. The board will vote on it today." Carter's face drained of color. "You're bluffing. You hacked my emails. This is illegal." "No," I said. "It's corporate oversight. Welcome to it." The board, sensing the shift, turned on them fast. One by one, they began flipping through the packets. Whispers rose. Richard tried to argue, to bluster, but the numbers didn't lie. When the vote came, it wasn't even close. Unanimous. Carter was stripped of all executive access. Richard was barred from company dealings effective immediately. Their keycards were deactivated before the meeting ended. I walked them to the elevator myself. "You're making a mistake," Richard said, his voice low, eyes narrowed. "You think this is over?" I leaned in slightly. "I don't think it's over," I whispered. "I know it's just beginning." Back in my office, I shut the door and finally allowed myself a moment to breathe. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with release. Years of being sidelined, dismissed, patronized, it was all unraveling, and I was the one pulling the thread. But I didn't stop there. I sent formal letters to every division head, outlining a zero-tolerance policy on fraud, nepotism, and toxic leadership. I installed transparency initiatives. I even launched an anonymous whistleblower program. The media got wind of the leadership shakeup, of course. Articles were printed. Headlines changed. Pierce heiress ousts father in power play was one of them. But they didn't know the truth. This wasn't a power play. It was survival. At home that night, I tucked my son in. He looked up at me and said, "Mommy, why did Grandpa look so mad today?" I paused. "Because," I said softly, brushing hair from his forehead, "he forgot that girls can be in charge too." He smiled and nodded, already dreaming. I walked out of his room and stood in the hallway, the weight of everything crashing over me in silence. I had done it, but I also knew Richard wouldn't go down quietly. He'd try lawsuits, leverage, emotional sabotage, maybe even try to turn my own family against me. That's what predators do when cornered. But here's the thing, you can't threaten a woman who's already been burned alive and climbed out of her own ashes. I was done being afraid of him, done shrinking, and now that I had the empire, his empire, I was going to make it better, cleaner, stronger, not for revenge, for legacy, for my son, for the girl I used to be, the one who believed her father's approval defined her worth, and for the woman I had become, a force he never saw coming. The first week after Richard and Carter were ousted was a blur of meetings, media calls, and whispered apologies from people who'd once looked through me like I was made of smoke. Now they called me Ma'am. They called me Ms. Pierce. But I was still just me, Natalie. A 32-year-old woman who'd spent most of her life being told to stay in her lane, who'd been laughed at, dismissed, underestimated, and now sat at the head of the table. There was a particular moment I'll never forget. It was a Thursday morning, the kind of crisp fall day where the sky looks impossibly blue and everything feels just a little cleaner than usual. I was walking into the office, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, skimming a memo about our upcoming philanthropic initiative. And that's when I saw him, Richard, standing outside the building, alone, no chauffeur, no entourage, just a man in a wrinkled overcoat and a stunned look on his face, like he couldn't quite believe the empire he built had survived without him. I walked past him, without breaking stride, but right before the glass doors slid shut behind me, I paused and looked over my shoulder. "Morning, Dad," I said, my voice calm, even. "You know what they say, pride comes before the fall." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. I'd already said everything that mattered. Back in my office, I finally allowed myself to feel it. That weight I'd carried for years, the ache of always needing his approval, his validation, his love, it was gone. Not because he finally gave it to me, but because I stopped needing it. And that was the real power. In the weeks that followed, I transformed Pierce Enterprises into something new, something real. We revamped our hiring practices, brought in young, diverse talent, increased maternity leave benefits, and created a mentorship program specifically for women rising through the ranks. The board saw it too. Not just numbers, but culture, energy, life. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about purpose. Still, there were moments when the ache returned, late at night, in quiet corners of my mind, because even when you win, betrayal leaves bruises. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering, would he have done this if I'd been a son? Did he ever really believe in me, even for a second? And worst of all, was there ever a version of this story where we stood side by side instead of across the battlefield? But healing isn't a straight line, it's messy. It backtracks, it surprises you. One day, months after the dust had settled, I got a package delivered to my office. No return address, just my name scrawled in familiar, shaky handwriting. Inside was a photo, old, worn. Me as a little girl, sitting on Richard's shoulders, grinning like I'd just won the world. On the back, 4 words in ink so faint I almost missed them. "You always had it." That was it. No apology, no explanation. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't need either. I slipped the photo into the top drawer of my desk next to the company seal. Not as a reminder of him, but of me. Of the girl who grew up and refused to stay small, and of the woman who built something bigger than any inheritance could buy, because in the end, the real inheritance wasn't money, it was fire. And I'd learned how to carry it. So now I want to ask you, yes, you reading this right now, what would you do if the people who were supposed to love and protect you became the ones who tried to bury you? Would you let them? Would you shrink, stay silent, wait for someone else to hand you your worth? Or would you rise? Would you sharpen your edges, own your scars, and build something they couldn't destroy, even if they tried? Because trust me, no one can define your power but you. Now it's your turn. What would you have done if you were me? Let's talk.